Thanks for coming back to another episode of Pitch It, a fintech conversation amongst founders, investors, and friends. I'm your host, Todd Anderson, Chief Content Officer at FinTech Nexus. And what we do is we take a peek behind the curtain. What motivates someone to start a company? How do investors make the right bet? What do accelerators do during and help enabling the process of growing your company? How do banks think of founders? Not to mention, we try to have some fun, and what you'll see is we'll also do some special episodes. We have some new features coming. So stick with us, and you'll get all you'll need to know about the fintech startup landscape. Pitch It is really a part of a larger podcast network here at FinTech Nexus. You can go to my colleague Peter, our co-founder and chairman, for FinTech One-on-One. You can subscribe to his feed, or we have our newest podcast by one of our writers, Isabel Castro, the FinTech Coffee Break. For everything produced by FinTech Nexus, you can check out FinTech Nexus Podcast, which is really our content fire hose. All shows, webinar replays, even in-person event content, not to mention our weekly news show. As always, we hope that you rate the show and write a review. I try to really take listener feedback seriously, and as it helps make the show better. You can also follow the podcast and all of our podcasts on the feed of your choice, whether it be Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen, or come directly to news.fintechnexus.com. Now, let's get on with the show. On today's episode, I'm joined by Olga Chin, founder and CEO of InterPrice Technologies. Olga and I discussed the founding story behind InterPrice, her path to financial services instead of, say, medical services, as you'll hear about in the episode, how InterPrice helps corporate treasury teams, the biggest problems that corporate treasury teams face, an unlikely byproduct of the InterPrice platform, raising capital, and much, much more. A couple of short PSAs before we get started. We are still accepting applications for our Pitch It at FinTech Nexus USA. Head to fintechnexus.com. The specific link will be in the show notes, and it'll take you to the application site. If you want to sponsor an episode, come on as a guest, or sponsor one of our many digital or in-person offerings, please reach out anytime. It's Todd, Todd, at fintechnexus.com. Without further ado, Olga Chin, founder and CEO of InterPrice Technologies. Enjoy the episode. Hi, Olga. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm good. Hi, Todd. Nice to be here.
Well, I like to kick off the show. If you can just give us a little bit of background about yourself professionally and tell us a little bit more about who you are.
Professionally, so I'm a former investment banker. I started out my career in the hedge fund space, actually, worked for an amazing person at Ellington Management Group, and then got into debt capital market space. I advised companies on various capital raising plans and did that for over a decade, and then started Enterprise.
So I believe it was on your website I read. This wasn't exactly your initial path though, right? I mean, I think you wanted to go to medical school and this was kind of the better of the two paths, but why investment banking, why finance?
Good research. Yes, I was a pre-med student. I took the MCATs. I actually got Harvard Med School average on the MCATs, which I'm very proud of. And then, in my junior year, I faced this decision. Do I go to, so I was an econ major as well. So do I go to medical school and take out $200,000 in loans?
Yeah.
Or do I try this internship at like a top 5 investment bank? Very superficial decision making as a junior in college. So I definitely took the investment banking path, never looked back, never, ever looked back. And now, when I go to the doctor, I can't even imagine. I was like, what was I thinking, even considering going into that? And of course, got lucky. But yeah, no, absolutely. It was not a plan at all.
So in terms of, founding a company and being an entrepreneur, was that something that you eventually saw on the horizon, or while being at the investment bank and some of the work that you were doing there, this problem cropped up and you found, hey, if no one else is solving it, maybe I should solve it myself.
So, a lot of people ask me, like, what was that moment? Like, a lot of people that I speak to who are founders, they would have this like profound moment when they're like, well, I have to do this. I'm not sure if I ever did,
I'm not
right?
sure that many founders actually have that moment either. I
Oh,
think they
okay.
like to have
So
that
thank you for
moment.
making me feel better about it. But look, no, I have a couple of things. So I always thought that I was going to do something on my own, but there's always like a personal thing too, right? So
Mhm.
frankly, I couldn't afford to do it until a
Yeah.
certain period of time, and we can talk more about that. That's a family story. But at some point, I actually remember I had this client. I'm not going to name them right now, but very, very large company. And I remember going to have dinner with them. And it was like a bunch of banks and the CFO and the treasurer of that company. And I remember being like, hey, so we come here, we fly to this town every 6 months or so, and you have like 30 banks. So do you have dinner with them every night? And the CFO goes, yeah, Tuesdays and Thursdays are banker dinner nights. Spending a lot of time on this.
Yeah.
I was like, well, so I'm also sending you a ton of information. Like I'm sending you these PDF files, proposals, and again, we'll get into that. What do you do with them? And he's like, well, I tried to look at them, but there's just like way too much. And after a couple of drinks with him, I said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we just like aggregated all that for you? And he goes, again, keep in mind, a couple of drinks into it. He goes, let's do it. I'll go in 50-50. I was like, that's interesting.
Wow.
So, and then I actually ended up calling another CFO, and this was the person who used to be the CFO of Kraft Heinz. So he's actually one of our largest investors right now, David Knopf. And I remember saying, "Hey, David, what do you think about this?" And he's like, "Oh, I'll totally back you for this." And you have these moments where like, well, if they're going to do it, like I should probably try, right? And that was
Yeah.
I think that was kind of the starting point. That dinner where the guy said 50-50, I was like, yeah, maybe I should do it.
At least you knew you had some merit in kind of that initial idea. So tell us a little bit more about exactly what Enterprise does, and when answering that question, where'd the name come from?
So it's funny, I was talking to the team earlier today and I mentioned this question. They said, oh, we have no idea where the name comes from. So they have to listen to this. So what we aggregate, we are a platform that aggregates information that banks send across to corporates, right? And it's called pricing. It's called pricing, like indications or
Yeah.
whatever it is, but the name is price. So it has to be price. And inter is the interconnectivity between banks and the corporate issuers. I came up with a name myself. I didn't want to be. I didn't want it to be about bonds or any other asset class. I wanted to be about broadly pricing. And so I was like, "Oh, enterprise sounds good." And then, of course, I go to enterprise.com, and it's a car website. But it's not just a car website. It's actually 3 years ago when I started this, there was a guy sitting in the Grand Cayman Islands who, like, when people would misspell enterprise rental cars and go to enterprise.com, he would collect their credit card information as if they were renting cars and actually just, take their money. So I called him. Yeah, I know. So I called him up and said, hey, you want to sell me the domain? Of course, he didn't want to do it. But anyway, long story short, is that Enterprise Rental Cars actually owns the domain right now. We're hoping to get it. But that's how the name came up. And, sometimes it gets confused with Enterprise, and we're hoping to change that. But yeah, so that's the name. In terms of where we are, so like I said, series of dashboards. I'll give you a good analogy.
Mhm.
For example, so you, Todd, I don't know if you own a house,
Yep.
maybe. Yeah, okay. So most people who own houses, they would try to take out mortgages. And there
Yep.
are two ways to do it. Imagine that there's way number one, where you call up Citibank, you call up Chase, whoever it is, and you get these 30-page documents with all kinds of legal stuff.
Yep.
And somewhere on page 32, there's going to be, Todd Anderson, 30-year, 15-year mortgage rate. So you can sit there on, at dinner, like spread them out on a kitchen table and compare them. Or imagine there's a website like bankrate.com where you can go and compare all the mortgage rates for you, not for anybody else, but for
Yeah.
you. So we're that for very large companies, literally.
So when going through this and kind of playing through and building out the idea, obviously I'm assuming that you probably talked to many different CFOs, many different treasurers. Was there a common theme as to what was the most, or the biggest impediment that they faced when going through some of their processes? Like, was it that I don't have time to go through all these papers and pricing that is sent to me, or it's never in a format that's easily readable, or it's in all these disparate systems and I can't spend 20 hours going through there and then trying to compare it to something in this system? Was there kind of a handful of common themes that would come up and ultimately helped you build out what the platform or dashboards are today?
Yeah, no, 100%. So I think, in answering the question, we got to get into the psychology of this a little bit. So if you're
Hmm.
the treasurer, right? Or yeah, let's take it from the banker's perspective. So when I was a banker, I would sit there and watch the market all day long because it was my job.
Hmm.
I knew exactly who was doing deals, who was placing paper where, who the investors were, all kinds of stuff. But that was my job. And I only covered bonds. Now, as you think about the CFO and the treasurer, they have to fund the businesses. They have to raise capital. They have to raise capital across different markets. So they have to talk to many of me, even at one bank. Never mind the fact that they have all kinds of other responsibilities.
Yeah.
So they're not sitting there watching the market all day long. And unfortunately, when bankers come to visit them, there's a little bit of the information asymmetry, right? Because and ultimately to them it matters a lot more. Every single basis point or every single percent in terms of their capital is actually incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
It really drives the bottom line. And so that's why they have the bankers coming to visit them, pitching the best ideas. But if you think about somebody like McDonald's, right? So let's take them as an example. They have, I think, over 30 different banks. And they come to visit them in teams, pitching all these ideas. And yes, they come in different formats. And treasury teams are incredibly small. There's also a rotation concept in many treasury teams. So information gets lost, and they honestly, they're just stretched incredibly thin.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the biggest theme as you think about kind of like what we're facing. And that's what we help them with. We provide essentially this like single source of truth. We aggregate all of it. It's available to anybody on the team. We provide a lot of training if the team rotates. That's been a consistent concept as well that we can talk about. So
And then in terms of working with the banks, do the banks also have to be an enterprise customer? How does some of the mechanics work? Cause say if I'm a McDonald's or another big corporate, I'm a customer of yours. Do the corresponding banks also have to be customers?
Not necessarily. We have built processes such that data gets in seamlessly anyway, but at the same time, we actually partner with a lot of the banks. There's going to be an official announcement next week about the top 5 bank who actually partners with us. But at the same time, we have about 15 of them already on the platform. Having said that, McDonald's can get any of the data from any of the banks automatically from themselves as well. But having said that, look, on the bank side, there's also a pain point. So think about, again, me as a former banker, I used to produce these nice little PDFs, like I had to paste the company logo.
Hmm.
And you know how that's done? It's actually like, this is how I did it. You would take an Excel, you would take a screenshot, you would paste it into PowerPoint, you PDF the PowerPoint,
Hmm.
and God forbid, like there's a wrong company name or something that happened to me. so, so there are pain points there that we tried to solve. So we actually have a banker platform, and we also have an API connection to banks that have their own platforms. So for companies that don't want to receive these emails, there is a solution. But from the banker side, we think of them as true partnerships. So we differentiate there a little bit.
How much, today, and I think it's true, across different capital markets and fundraising activities is still a lot of it done in the way in which you described earlier, which is the dinner and kind of schmoozing the relationship. I mean, some of what you're providing is moving more into the future, which is making the part of raising money, however you're doing that, in a lot more of an automated, seamless, transparent way versus like a backroom deal after a few drinks and a dinner. It seems like the old way was what got us to a certain point, but now scaling through technology allows you just to get so much more out of it. And it sounds like that's what you are trying to provide to a lot of these corporates.
Well, of course, there are movies about Wall Street where you have these like backroom deals. Yeah, that I think that's mostly in the movies, though. I would say a lot of the people on Wall Street are actually incredibly sophisticated, and the ideas they pitch are pretty, it has a lot of merit to a lot of the companies. I've been, from that perspective. Um, Having said that, there are two components to it. Why does McDonald's deal with 30 different banks? They're called relationship banks. There's actually this concept in the corporate treasury finance called relationship banks. Why? Because these relationship banks provide what's called revolving credit facilities and other credit facilities to essentially help McDonald's if it ever runs into a bad situation. Think of it as almost like credit card. Now, these banks are truly supportive of these corporate treasury teams. There's usually in a bank, somebody's called a relationship manager that actually manages like all these different groups pitching ideas to the corporate treasury teams. That is really important. I would say that despite the fact that we bring technology and we aggregate all this information, that is why we do it, because we want the relationship to actually get, not even better, but we want people to spend more time on the relationship. And the data is there as, for a reason, for data-driven organizations. I wouldn't take that relationship aspect out of it. Having said that, don't think of it as terms of movies. It's not like that at all. I've never seen any backroom deals personally, to be honest. But the relationship manager usually controls the discussion. I think that's actually incredibly important.
So in terms of what you guys have provided to your clients thus far, is there something that has come back to you through clients that has been either the biggest benefit of the platform, or kind of what has been their feedback to InterPrice that, hey, you've saved us time, you've saved us money, you've saved us X? Is there something that you're hearing from clients that is kind of most popular or most prevalent?
So a couple of not so interesting is exactly like what you mentioned, right? So saving time, saving money, right? So like that's always been the theme, and we've always wanted to do that. Obviously, we save time, especially with the team turnover and the team rotation. That's there. We have a case study where we actually save basis points on issuance by providing a lot of this information. So that's there. The most fascinating piece to me, there are actually two. So it's about best practices. So if you think about somebody, like IBM or Amazon or Waste Management or Current Pepper, some of these large companies, they're pretty spread out geographically, and they don't usually tend to interact with each other. But these are huge organizations, and they have some of the best practices, right? But they each differ. And what if you can actually bring them into this like almost community aspect of it and have them share the best practices amongst themselves? Totally, like that's not our business model in any kind of way, but I'll never forget, like not this December, but the last December, my entire team was sitting there saying, hey, so what do we do now? It's like December, nobody wants to talk sales with us, right? So like, what do we do?
Yeah.
They said, well, why don't we get a whole bunch of these treasury teams on the phone and just do like a holiday type thing, talk about commercial paper strategies if they want to, but really like keep it very personal. So we did that. Send out an invite. I'll never forget. It was like December 17th, like when everybody should be on vacation.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, it's like 40 people dial in. And you have people from like Comcast or some of these organizations, And they're looking at each other being like, oh my God, I'm not the only one using this startup, platform. That's number one. So that's good for me.
Yeah.
But they start sharing ideas that are actually really unique. And I'm sitting there being completely awe, like I can build so much based on this feedback.
Yeah.
So we've been doing all kinds of community events. We actually have one coming up next week about women in treasury. And we have about, I want to say like 25 of the, of women from some of the largest treasury organizations in the world, like even in Europe, dialing in. And I think that's pretty huge. So the sharing of best practices, I don't want to underestimate that. And I think that's actually what makes InterPrice so successful, is like this community aspect of it.
Fascinating. In terms of another topic that's been very much in the news right now, and I'm curious if there's been an appetite, through what you do in terms of the digital asset space and crypto space. I'd say save maybe the last 6 months when things kind of probably fell off a cliff. But before that, had you seen interest in treasuries and CFOs in wanting to learn more about, or whether or not your platform would be able to handle digital assets, and has it come up? Is it a popular topic?
I wish. So the true answer is that, I see like all these startups popping up in the digital asset space, and it all sounds so sexy, and I wish that I did that. We work with some of the most conservative organizations in the
I figured
world.
as much, but you do hear that there are some corporates that are beginning to look at the space, but it's probably more in the sense of what this might mean, and not actually holding any of that on their balance sheet or anything today.
I think you're absolutely right. People are curious. We heard that come up a couple of times. I would say more in the exploratory sense. We do have one client who is in the payment space that's looking into it. That's about it, to be completely honest. I hope that changes. If anybody wants to pay us in crypto, I'm totally fine accepting that. But otherwise, that's about as far as that goes.
Yeah, and these days you figure with the last 6 months and how much regulators are starting to crack down on the space, it probably will be shelved for the time being. I'd be curious. You've been around for I think it's a little over 3 years, or just coming up on 3 years. What's the either biggest or one of the biggest lessons you've learned about your company, InterPrice, since you've started?
Um, so for me, the lessons about finance and everything else, those are probably not the biggest ones. I spent enough time on Wall Street to
Yeah.
understand what these companies are dealing with. I think to me, the biggest lesson is probably just dealing with people and emotions when dealing with people. I got a crash course in some of that stuff, during the history of enterprise. And I'm sure so has any other founder. But you're emotionally invested, right? You're spending so much time with these people. You get very, very close, and we've had situations where somebody received a medical diagnosis that was absolutely terrible, right? And what I always say is that there's no textbook answer to that,
Hmm.
at all. And so you learn how to deal with emotions. You learn how to almost like grow up emotionally. To me, I'm sure any other founder would say, very similar thing, from HR perspective. Definitely get better at it. Not sure if it's ever going to get easier emotionally. So the highs are highs and the lows are lows when it comes to people. But that's probably the biggest one. I've never anticipated that to be the case, to be completely honest. I thought we were going to have issues with, the banks and the corporates and the platform breaking and, all kinds of stuff. But no, it's really been making sure that everybody's happy, making sure that we all row in the same direction.
Do you have a regret that you can share with the
I,
audience?
I probably do. Early on, we kind of thought treasury teams are all the same, right? So, you look at data, you analyze data, you make a decision, you fund your business. That's about it, right? Let's go back to my bankrate.com analogy. So, for example, you get proposals from JP Morgan and you get a proposal from Bank of America and, Citi. Say your brother works at Citi, right? You're no longer driven maybe by that percentage number on page 32. You're
Mm-hmm.
driven by something else. Unfortunately, in corporate treasury teams, that does happen. It doesn't happen very often, but there are a couple of situations where early on we spend time with people who are not as data driven. They probably aren't the right first customer for us, and we try to adapt to them quite a bit. And in the end, at some point, we just said, look, we just got to figure out like where the usage is, and we got to flow in that direction and spend more time there. That's probably the biggest regret, not recognizing that there is this possibility that you are not driven by data in any way. Again, very, very seldom that it does happen, but we've encountered that.
The best piece of advice that you've gotten so far since starting the company?
Somebody told me that, managing a startup is like managing a sports team, right? And I was like, well, I don't know much about sports. So I was like, what does that mean? And so they said, look, when you watch Super Bowl, you have this coach and you have quarterback. And do they know where the ball is going to go? Absolutely not, like at all. They don't even know like what's going to happen the next second.
Yep.
But it's not that they can stand, like the quarterback can't just stand there and be like, well, if I calculate the probability of doing this, like it doesn't work, right? He has to throw the ball somewhere. And the decision has to be fast and he has to own it. It's the same thing. So I'm sitting here, I never have enough perfect information at all. I wish I did. We have different customers, different personalities, different contracts, like different bank partnerships. At some point, you just got to make a decision, stick with it. And unfortunately, that responsibility is on me, right? And it's the same thing as in sports. And you just have to approach it and understand that that's the case. And I think to me that made sense. Like when somebody told me that, it truly adapted. I can see myself as like this almost like quarterback coach type person.
You've mentioned team a few times. Tell us a bit more about those around you. How big is the team today? Kind of what does the team look like in terms of makeup? Technology people, salespeople. Kind of what does the entire team look like?
Early on, I had a partner who joined me in this journey. His name is Dylan Barger. He was actually my analyst when I was fairly early on in banking. So I trained him. He joined me right out of school. And then I convinced him to join. Somehow, I have no idea how I did that. I still remember that conversation. Yeah, boggles my mind that he actually agreed to do it. So Dylan is the chief product officer. So he leads everything on the technology side, on the product side. I hate to say this and I hope to change this, but most of our company is actually tech. So we have about 30 of us. And unfortunately, I'm having the hardest time hiring account executives. So it's literally me and two more people on the business side. The rest is all tech. Most of us are in New York. We actually opened an office recently. It's tiny. It's absolutely tiny. People look at it and be like, "That's your office?" Yeah, but it's a conference room. It's on 50th and Park. We're very proud of it.
Hey, an office in New York City is a big deal.
It is.
It's a good marker for a company, especially a early stage company as they're continuing to grow.
I'm excited about it. Yeah.
I saw that you had raised around in, I think it was early November, somewhere around that time frame. How was raising capital for the business, and what'd you learn about either yourself or the company going through those pitches, talking to investors, and what can you tell us about the fundraising process?
Last year was tough. I'm sure that you heard about, obviously what's happening in the market.
Mm-hmm.
We actually, just to backtrack a little bit, we raised the seed round the year prior to that, a much easier process.
Oh yeah.
Significantly easier. We got a term sheet right away from somebody that I've known for a while who was almost like an advisor to me, and Lauren Shaw from Bowery Capital. And then we tried to raise almost starting 6 months before we closed. We had different conversations, but ultimately the goalposts were moving.
Yeah.
And last year was also the first year that we started making money. And so you think about like pitching to investors, And you're like, well, when you're starting to get these contracts and every week you would get some new information, you're pitching, and it was very disjointed in terms of what the goalposts were from that perspective. Having said that, the NASDAQ team was actually there very early on. They understand the business, so that was the key. We pitched to some traditional Silicon Valley investors who, ultimately if the market is great, then this is a cool fintech company. If the market is
Yeah.
not so good, it's like, what are you talking about, treasury? And then like nobody understands treasury. Like, what does that even mean? The NASDAQ team understood it. They actually have their own treasury team that's a user, or at that point potential user of InterPrice. That helped a lot, and they were incredibly supportive during the entire journey. So we got a term sheet from them back in May, I want to say, and then we went through the investment process and got co-lead investors. So it took a little while to close because of the market, but I'm just grateful that like the market. I remember the days when in the summer the market was falling apart, and they were still incredibly supportive. I'm truly grateful for that.
Yeah. When comparing the two rounds, I mean, how along the way when you're getting either the goalposts moving or you're getting a lot of no's, even though you have this good signal from a NASDAQ Ventures, I mean, what does that do to the psychology? Does it ever make you doubt yourself? I mean, I'm sure you go through all these different waves of emotions of, all right, we're gonna raise money, or all right, how the light's gonna go on the next month. And
Yeah,
it
it's all
puts a lot of
that.
strain on teams.
It is a lot of strain on teams, but you know what? I truly subscribe to like this radical candor theory. So my team understands that, outside of anything like compensation related or anything like that, like, they very well understand what's going on. We have weekly calls with the entire team where we share, customer contracts, like what's working, what's not working, partially because I don't want to sugarcoat it. Like, what's the
Yeah.
point, right? It makes no sense. And so, yeah, we've had some there were tough days for sure, but as a team, somehow, I don't know, we have this like core group of almost like partners at the company, and nobody had like a bad day at the same time. So when we would talk about it, we were like, oh my god, the market is falling apart, like I don't know how we are going to keep the lights on. One of us would be optimistic. That's all it took. And
Sometimes that's all you need.
I know, and one of us will be like, okay, guys, let's just keep it real. It's okay. We have these term sheet. We have this term sheet. But no, it's tough. It's brutal. It's what we say like between Dylan and me. There was a phrase we used early on. So it's like eating glass every day until you get used to it, and it gets better and better, and you get used to eating glass every day.
Not sure I can ever get used to eating glass, but if another founder picked up the episode, what piece of advice would you want to give to them?
Fail fast and fail often. Literally, don't be afraid of mistakes. Because if you're looking, like, for example, early on, I was like, oh, this customer doesn't like this feature. That's actually a good thing that that they don't like this feature. Because if you're looking for affirmation, you, fine, you can build stories for yourself. But ultimately, if you can fail fast and know what's not working, you're so much closer to what is working. So don't be afraid of it.
Do you think sometimes founders get in trouble, and you hinted at it at your answer earlier when you talked about not all treasury teams are the same? Like, do founders and entrepreneurs, maybe they get in trouble to try to build everything for everyone, when in reality, not every feature is going to be there right away. Not everyone's going to like the product, but ultimately you need to know who you're building for and then iterate on that over time.
No, 100%. Because I think so. As a founder, a startup is your baby, and all of a
Yeah.
sudden you're saying that somebody tells you your baby is not cute. I mean, that hurts,
Oh yeah.
right?
I have two kids, so yeah, that would hurt.
So I am at a fault for doing that, but I actually have somebody on my team, Dave, who handles all of the customer relationships. And sometimes like somebody introduces me to a customer who's maybe like high yield, who, we'll approach them later, but they're not the perfect customer for us right now. And I'm like, oh my God, I got this lead. And Dana's like, yeah, not the right one, not the right one. So I am at a fault because again, it's my baby and I have
Yeah.
people who continuously, I have gotten better about it, but no, 100%, it is your baby.
So we have just a few minutes left. I'd like to end a little bit lighter. Do you have a favorite book or the last book that you read?
I have two sets of books that I read. One of them is like business books, right? And one of them is like, I hate to admit, I read like a lot of weird romance novels too, just to get my mind off things.
Whatever works.
I know, well, we can talk about that too. But no, I like this book recently that I call, it was called like Reboot, about leadership. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's like about the art of growing up, and it's about radical counter for teams. Like it inspires CEOs to kind of look within themselves and within their teams and be accountable for the choices. So like a lot of the same themes that we talk about. I think it's called, yeah, Reboot.
What do you do? All founders need to step away, keep their minds clear, and not run themselves into the ground. So what do you do to unwind? How do you kind of keep your brain and yourself fresh for the team?
So I need to shut my brain off, and I found different ways to do it. A couple of sports exercises, like I do Zumba, where the music is so loud your brain can't think. A couple of years ago, I got into a Bikram yoga, which is 105 or whatever it is degree room for 90 minutes, and you think about dying the entire time. So like you
Wow,
literally just want to get through it. Actually, I did that recently with the treasurer of NASDAQ too, so it was a good bonding experience.
I bet.
But stuff that just your brain needs to shut off,
Yeah.
or sometimes like doing something silly, like even some of the TV shows I watch, I just need to get into it, so I don't think about like, hey, did I get back to this client?
Yep. Um, you mentioned you don't really watch sports, but do you have a favorite sport or an activity that you kind of enjoy doing yourself outside of the obviously the yoga and the Zumba?
You know what? I'm gonna be boring with that. I really, really like. I think if my husband were into sports, I probably would watch stuff. But unfortunately, like even in college, I used to do competitive ballroom dancing. Out of all things, believe it or not.
Hmm.
So that stuff like that. But no, I mean, I'll watch it like with my friends, like, and I'll be really, really supportive. But no, yeah, sorry.
No, it's funny because there's two reasons why I asked the question. One is because I'm personally a very big sports fan, but the other reason I asked for it, and it was where I usually get the most interesting answers, is most founders don't watch sports like a typical sport. Most
Mm,
founders either do something themselves, they do a sport, they'll go rock climbing or bicycling or
that too.
something like that. Or they are not into sports because they're just different. Their minds work differently. They tend to work differently in how they do their jobs, and so I always find it interesting to hear what founders find interesting in their personal lives, because it tends to be a little bit different than, say, the typical person that might work like a normal job.
So it's really interesting that you say that. It makes me feel better, first of all, so I appreciate that. But so you mentioned rock climbing. So my daughter is actually on a rock climbing team. I have a teenage daughter, and also a son. And sometimes I sit there, and this used to be when she was a swimmer too. I'm sitting there like watching her practice, and I'm like, this makes me feel so inadequate. So I start like rock climbing myself. So I do a
That's
little
pretty
bit of
funny.
that.
Do you have a favorite vacation spot?
Travel a lot. Actually, I got back from Morocco a couple of days ago. Not the favorite vacation spot. Costa Rica, probably. Love Costa Rica. Love the people. Love the climate. Anything warm or like Turks and Caicos or.
Yeah, I went there on my honeymoon, Turks and Caicos. So I think we're planning to go back sometime soon. And then final question, biggest inspiration in life, what inspires you?
So you know what, I thought about this when you sent this over, and I was gonna say, is it a person or like or something? I don't know if I have like this big agenda, like, oh, I want to do this and become this. Like, there's no grandiose theme. In terms of people inspiration, I mean, I think that I'm supposed to say my parents. So I apologize, mom and dad. Like, I'm not going to say that, although I love them to death. But there's somebody who was really important to me early, like in the journey. My husband, one of my husband's closest friends, and one of my closest friends too, is the founder of Noom. I don't know if you've heard of them. Noom.
Yeah, it's like I don't know if they would call themselves a weight loss company, but it kind of helps you rethink on how you consume food, how you live your life.
Yeah, so Artem Petikoff was one of our college friends, and we are still very, very close friends to this day. And I remember about a few weeks before I went full time with Enterprise, we had dinner with him, and I was talking to him like, "Whoa, it sucks! Like I'm leaving a banker job, like, and like, oh my god, this is crazy." And he gave me a lot of advice, and he always comes up. And first of all, huge inspiration. I mean, his company is like crazy successful,
Oh yeah.
like insane. I remember when he first started, he came over to our house, and I was like, "You're crazy." I remember thinking like,
And
"Oh
now
my."
there's like 4 or 5 companies that are do similar things that they do in terms of the psychology of weight loss and everything.
Yeah, so no, so it's a completely inspiring how he started this like huge trend. But he's also really, really cool to me personally as an inspiration, because he would text me things like I would text him 3 years ago, being like, I'm really scared or something like that. And he would screenshot this and send it to me like 3 years later and be like, hey,
Hmm.
remember that? And to me, like that, like his journey is so inspiring. So probably that.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap up. Olga, I greatly appreciate you coming on the show. If someone wanted to reach out, if they wanted to get in touch with either you or Enterprise, how would they do that?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn, but also just go to the website, or just email me, Olga at enterprisetech.com, and I'll respond.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming on the show. Continued success to you and the team, and hopefully we'll get you back sometime in the future.
Thanks, Todd.
Thank you.